Hey, it's Vadim, re-recording the intro because of an interesting thing. I had a mismatched sample rate on my preamp, which has a digital converter in it. If you're confused about that, go back to episode 2, where we talk about what that means. But I had a different sample rate on my converter than I did on my interface, and wow, it sounded awful. I got this crackly, clicky stuff, and good lesson there to always check yourself before you wreck yourself on sample rate. Anyway, yes, check out our shiny new website if you haven't already. You can go to DIYrecordingguys.com. You can search for episodes by topic there. You can also browse episodes by category. And you can get to show notes. You can just type in that website, DIYrecordingguys.com/the episode number, and you will see show notes. And those show notes are slowly being expanded into kind of like mini blog articles. This week is for all you bass players who felt neglected over the last 2 weeks when I did a deep dive into recording heavy guitars. This week is Ben's deep dive on all things related to bass tone. And then, similarly to what we did for guitars, the next week will be about how to actually record whatever bass tone Ben came up with. So we get into a lot of things. I actually learned a lot from Ben in this episode. You know, I play bass occasionally in the studio on sessions or on my own songs, but definitely lack some knowledge on this topic, and I took a lot away from it. We get into why technique is even more important for tone on bass than it is on guitar. We get into fingerstyle versus picking as a technique. We talk about how using a pick is actually a little bit like using a compressor, which is maybe counterintuitive. We talk about different bass designs and how they affect tone. Ben gets into some different sounds associated with some different manufacturers. Ben talks about 3 different types of bass distortion and what they do, and I found this very helpful as a characterization or a way to think about different types of bass distortion. He talks about the importance of a compressor in a bass signal chain, why it's so much more important than for guitar. And then we get into amps. We talk about tube amps versus solid-state amps. We talk about how much power your amp actually needs. As you'll hear, Ben has some really like nuclear warfare rated amps, which is crazy. And then finally, Ben has a shocking conclusion, which is going to lead into next week's episode, where he actually plays samples of the tones he recorded. He tried a lot of different mic techniques, similarly to what I did in last week's episode. And he comes to a bit of a shocking conclusion, which he will reveal at the end of this episode. As always, if you have any comments or questions, you can reach out. You can get me at Vadim at DIYrecordingguys.com. Ben is at Ben@DIYrecordingguys.com. We hope to hear from you. Cheers.
You're listening to the DIY Recording Guys podcast, your one-stop information source for DIY music production, with your hosts, Vadim Karaz and Benjamin Hall.
Okay, welcome again to another episode of the DIY Recording Guys. As always, I'm your host, Benjamin Hall from Dreamout Studio.
And I'm Vadim from Calm Frog Recording. Been a while, Ben. I feel like it's been a while since I've seen your shining face.
Dude, it's been forever. So weird.
I don't know what happened. The hurricane, the pandemic.
Yeah.
A whole slew of things tripping us up.
A lot of things. I went out to see the in-laws recently. That was the
that's
most recent
right.
thing. Yeah.
Yeah, I forgot about that. Yeah. It's like a mini vacation. You guys actually flew out there, right?
Yeah. So I have to tell you about traveling during COVID because it's weird.
Yes, tell me. I'm very interested.
It's weird because I was actually really impressed with airport security and TSA because you have an extra level of delay with just everybody having to wear masks all the time, but it actually sped up the boarding process, I feel like. Although I guess there's less people flying. The way they're doing things now, I don't know how other airlines do it, but I mostly fly Delta when I do fly. And before they would always have all the special gems they board first. You know, the Medallion and the Diamond members and all the different ones. They all board first, and then they make all the people. It's like the walk of shame. So all the really privileged people, or all the people that have money, they get to sit in their seats and watch and heckle. I'm guessing that's what they're doing in their heads. They get to heckle everybody else as they walk by them to their seats, you know, and just the economy seating. But now with COVID, they're boarding things in opposite order, which makes so much more sense to me. Why would you want to get on a plane and then sit there and wait for everybody else to like bump by you and get on it? And, like, you're already sitting there for 4 hours anyways if you're flying from the east to west coast.
Yeah, that's true. I did never understand that rush to board, but I will tell you, Ben, that I am one of the gems because...
Are you a gem?
I used to... Yes, I am. I used to fly so much for work.
Oh, really?
That I got some kind of crazy status with Star Alliance to the point where, like, I can use the lounges and stuff. So, like...
Oh, I'm so jealous.
I am one of the people, and I can confirm that I do heckle everybody in my head. I have a smug half smirk on my face as I'm boarding and, you know, eating my croissant.
You never make eye contact with people. You just look at them out of the corner of your eye and then look back while you're reading your paper.
Yeah. I'm wearing sunglasses, actually. I used to wear sunglasses 100% of the time.
Did you really?
And a fedora. No, not.
Oh my gosh. So funny. But anyways, it was just nice to get out. And I don't know about you. I was actually going to post this in the group, and I might sometime later this week or next week. But sometimes I like to get away from the art that we typically do just to get inspired. And there's nothing like just kind of looking at nature and thinking about how that makes me feel as far as the sounds go, and then maybe want to reproduce that on guitar, how a sunrise made me feel type of a thing. Do you ever do stuff like that?
Yeah. Absolutely. I had the same thought recently where it's like inspiration for music doesn't come from music. It comes from things outside of music, right? And that's... Yeah. Nature is... actually, there's a subreddit called Nature is Metal, I think. And it's just like animals eating each other and stuff, if I'm not mistaken.
Oh my gosh. Not for the faint of heart.
No. What are we talking about, man? You wrote your magnum opus as you described it in your text message to me. What's it about?
So we're going to be like we did back in way back in episode 13, where we did a guitar tone deep dive. We're going to do the bass version of that. And I guess in my head, I thought this is just going to be a little tag on top of what we've already talked about with guitar, because, you know, what is bass but a guitar with 2 less strings, really? So,
oh my God, I never thought I'd hear the day.
Right? I mean, that's the like criticism that guitar players give like bass players all the time, but you know, like all in good fun.
Okay.
What I came back with was like 5 pages worth of single spaced notes, all on dialing in bass tone, and there's a lot to be said. You know, like a guitar, it's very similar in its functionality and kind of the way that it works, and even how you dial in tone, but there's also some very unique and different things that you're trying to get out of a bass guitar, especially in the context of a mix or in a song that's different as opposed to getting and dialing in your guitar tone. So I just wanted to talk about that.
I love your notes on this. I can't wait to get into it. But before we even do that, maybe explain, as I know we had a question in our Facebook group today when we were just chatting about this with people. There was a question that came up about, you know, what do we even mean when we say dialing in tone? So maybe talk about that concept a little bit.
That's a great question, by the way, because sometimes I get so caught up in the jargon that I forget
me too.
Yeah, I forget that might be foreign to some people. But like the person who commented said, you know, are we talking about turning knobs? Essentially, yeah, that's where it begins. That's what we're talking about, is how are we turning the equalizer on the preamp of our pickups on our bass to dial, air quotes, dial in tone? How are we turning the knobs on our pedals or our amplifiers to dial in tone? How are we turning the gain knobs and the EQs and the compressor knobs on our interfaces to dial in the tone that we want? But it goes so much farther than that. I think that's kind of where that idea comes from, is turning a dial that's what you mean by dialing in, or maybe even from old school TVs where you turn the dial to dial in a channel. That's where that idea of tone comes from. But as we'll talk about in the notes today, that's only a small part of what dialing in a tone means, because it goes to everything from your playing style to the instrument that you're playing and the wood that it's made out of, or other types of materials. And I mean, the possibilities are just endless.
Sure, and that's why it's such a fun journey. But I think you hit the nail on the head, which is that broadly speaking, your tone ultimately is the sound that people are hearing that's coming out of the speakers. And when we talk about dialing it in, we talk about all of the different levers, quote unquote, all the different things we can affect in the chain up to that, which you mentioned. You know, are you using a pick or is it finger style? All the literal dials and knobs, all of the things you can affect to get to that final tone that you want. That's what we talk about, is that process of getting the final sound you're looking for.
One interesting thing that I want to bring up is that as primarily a bass player, so I jumped right into learning bass, whereas I feel like a lot of people, even bass players, they start out as guitar players and then they move over to bass, or, oh, we already have, you know, you're the third guitar player and, oh, we already have two guitar players in the band. Can you play bass instead? Like that happens so much. Yeah. So I think maybe differently than somebody who had started with guitar, as a bass player, I don't think we think about tone as much as guitar players do.
Really?
At least in the same way. Like, to me, at least whenever I'm learning, and maybe I'm getting ahead of myself here a little bit, because I did want to talk about my tone journey a little bit, and maybe I'll save that for later. But really for me, tone was more about how I was playing and kind of figuring out stylistically what my playing was going to be, more than the bass that I had or the amp I was playing through. So that definitely influenced my journey a lot, where I felt like tone to me was using my fingers to try to get whatever, to reproduce whatever I was hearing on the radio, more than using effects or gear in particular. And I think that it really served me well. Not that you can only do that and ignore everything else, but I think it made me realize how important just figuring out your playing style and honing just the touch, like your hands on the instrument, make a huge influence in what your tone sounds like.
Yes. And do you think that's a function? I agree with you, by the way. For some reason, my feeling is that technique plays an even bigger role on bass than it does on guitar. So that's kind of my question for you, is do you think it's a function of the instrument and how it's used in modern music, or do you think it's a function of kind of you as a musician?
I think traditionally, because I'm a little bit older, so
come on.
a little bit older than these young guns coming up. And when I was growing up, we didn't have as much access to the internet and gear rundowns. Like now they're everywhere. Now you know what like everybody is playing and playing through. But I can remember back in the day where you would get on blogs where they would have these really terrible photos taken from people in the crowd of like, what is on that guy's pedal board? Trying to figure out what people are playing through. Can you relate to this?
Yeah.
So I feel like back in the day, even more so for bass players, there was a lot of guys just kind of plugging their bass straight into an amp, and that was their signal chain. Not everybody, but I think that was a lot more common back in the day than it even is now. Like now it's a lot more acceptable, especially with how even metal has gotten even more aggressive, where the bass guitar is taking on a more guitar-like role. And so we're processing bass guitar a lot more than we ever did before, and adding distortion and compression and just different interesting things to it. So I think it's a nature of just kind of the history of the instrument.
Interesting.
Which was kind of the way that I learned too. So that's why I wanted to bring that up at the beginning, because I think maybe a 16 or a 20-year-old that wants to pick up bass is, if they go on the internet to kind of learn, you know, what kind of gear do I need to buy to get the tone I want, you're going to be overwhelmed with people talking about distortion pedals and compressors and overdrives and limiters and everything else. But I do think it's important to take a step back and just kind of think about and develop or get a sense of what are my fingers doing to the tone of just playing my bass going through an amp.
Yeah, I think you're right. So yeah, basically you're saying you were in a situation where, because even the information wasn't available, you were forced to try to replicate the sounds you heard through the only tools you had, which was your hands and your playing style. And so you kind of learned how to adapt. Are there times when you're recording bass, like, are you always playing finger style, or are there applications where you would use a pick?
Yeah, that's a good question. So when I learned, I was 100% finger style, but over the years, I started playing more and more with a pick, and I realized that the pick just imparts such a different tone than fingers do. So it is totally stylistically and tone related when I choose to use a pick or not.
Gotcha. I don't want to jump ahead if that's part of your discussion,
No, that's totally
but
fine.
I'm always curious about that. Okay.
Yeah, so I think there are some guys out there that can only play with a pick, and that's fine. And there's some guys out there that can only play finger style, and that's fine too, because you can kind of round out your tone to make a pick sound more like fingers, and you can make fingers sound more aggressive with EQ and other things, so it sounds more like a pick. So
Gotcha, yep.
It's not like you have to do one or the other, but I just found for myself that I wanted to learn both techniques just in case I ever needed them in whatever scenario I found myself in.
Yeah, I know when I, like, for my projects, because I am a guitar player, my finger playing is terrible on bass. So what I did was, I mean, if it's a softer, like if it's a song that needs a rounder tone, I bought these like really thick rubber picks and these like fuzzy picks that kind of really have a dull sound, almost like finger style. But I did that purely because I couldn't play the parts I wanted to play with my fingers. So it was more like making up for a deficiency in my playing.
Yeah, it's not quite exactly the same, but like you said, there are workarounds if you can't get because it takes a long time to get the finger style down. It's a very unique motion. You're kind of dragging the meaty, fleshy part of the pads of your fingers across the string in a way, so it's not like a clean strike that a pick would have. You're kind of pulling on it, and the flesh of your finger imparts so much character and tone in and of itself. So it is like an interesting and different and weird technique, but I think those kind of things shine through, especially if you hear somebody like Jaco Pastorius, who's a great jazz bass player, and just all the feeling just comes from his fingers. It's 100% right there.
Interesting. What are you playing in the fell?
That's all slap bass pretty much. Slap bass and finger style, just from the nature of what it is. I've tried to. There are a couple lines in there that would make sense to do with a pick, just because they're so fast. But to switch from slap to pick style and then back again, it just kind of doesn't make too much sense. Yeah, good question though.
Okay, cool. All right, man. Well, where do you want to start with this? With this beast?
Yeah, let's start from the top. So I kind of want to talk about just like we did back in episode 13 about when we were talking about dialing in guitar tone. Let's talk about where does tone come from in the first place. And you kind of stole my thunder a little bit, but that's all great because that's the first thing I wanted to talk about. Like
okay.
It's kind of like how we talked about with our signal chain in many episodes before, where kind of the things that happen first in the chain are more important than the things that happen down the road a little bit. And there are a couple caveats to this, but I totally think the number one important thing when it comes to tone is just realizing that your fingers or pick are they have the biggest effect on tone whenever you're playing. Because even as a bass player or a guitar player, just playing more aggressively outputs more volume, so you can overdrive your tone just in that way. It has a huge effect.
Sure.
Yeah, so it's a big deal. we talked about fingerstyle a lot, so let's talk about picks a little bit more. The gauge of the pick actually affects the tone a lot. I prefer medium to heavy gauge. I just don't like things that are too heavy on bass because I kind of like how Nolly talks about the lighter picks can kind of give you a natural compression.
Yeah, I love that. So what that is when you're picking hard with a pick that's quote unquote lighter, which I'll ask you about that in a minute. But basically, because the pick has some like springiness to it, it actually kind of acts like a compressor because if you're picking really hard, the pick will give the same amount each time, and it helps you control your dynamics a bit. So I wanted to ask you this question because I know I had heard Nolly say the same thing, and I remember you telling me that when he's talking about a quote-unquote light pick, it's still pretty freaking heavy. So give us an idea here, like, because I'm familiar with, people may be familiar with guitar picks, medium, heavy guitar picks. How do the pick gauge for bass differ? Are bass gauges heavier to begin with than guitar pick gauges?
I don't think there's too many companies out there making like bass picks, so
okay,
I think they're kind of the same all around. Like you won't see like bass gauges or whatnot.
Okay, so like, what do you consider like a heavy gauge or like a medium heavy gauge for bass that you would use?
Medium heavy would probably be like a 0.8 or a 0.9 millimeter.
Okay, so about the same as a guitar, yeah.
Yeah, I think that kind of what I prefer to play is a 0.7. So it has enough give, but if you go any lighter than that, you're going to break a lot of picks.
I'm looking at, I use a 0.86 for guitar.
That's nice. You know what's funny? If I'm
heavy,
playing,
yeah.
if I'm playing leads on guitar, I use a heavier pick. I like to use a heavier pick than I do on bass. And I think that's kind of
more
common.
Control, right?
More control, and when you want to really hit a note, it's immediate. You know what I mean? And you don't need that as much on bass. Like, I used to think that when I first was playing or learning pick style on bass, I thought, oh, I need to just go as heavy as I possibly can so that the pick isn't weak, or flimsy or whatever. But I realized it's all really about control, and I just didn't have control of my technique yet. So after learning like kind of how playing with a pick feels, I kind of preferred to back off the gauge a little bit. So
interesting.
Yeah, it doesn't matter. It's just whatever feels good to you. But it does change. It does change the tone of the bass itself. Based on what your gauge is.
What I like to do on guitar actually is I did this recently is when I'm done when you're trying to talk about this whole process, when you get to the end and you're kind of happy with the tone you have, then it's a cool idea to like try a bunch of different picks and see what the subtle differences are. And I've even done this. I did this. I don't know if it makes a difference or not, but I've used like one pick gauge to track like the right channel guitars and then a different pick gauge to track the left channel. Just to see what that would do. But yeah, anyway, go on.
No, that's interesting.
A little aside.
Yeah, that's an interesting idea though. I like that.
Just to get like a little difference between the two sides,
Yeah. So this is the same with, I don't know, I've never really thought about this when it comes to guitar because I kind of just always strike my guitar strings in the same position. But on bass, I'll vary where I'm plucking the strings in relation to the pickup. Like if I want a more warm or rounded tone, I'll pluck closer to where the neck connects to the body of the guitar because it's warmer up there. And if I want something that's maybe more thin sounding or funky, I'll play a lot closer to the bridge. So the location of where you're striking the string makes a big difference too.
Wow. Okay.
I don't know if do guitar players think about that, or do you pretty much want to play right over top of where the pickups are?
I mean, I definitely can. I know what you're saying because if you pick really close to the bridge, you do get like a really crystally kind of thin, bright sound. I'm not a good enough guitar player to like care about those subtleties, but I don't want to speak for all guitar players because I'm sure there are some out there that think about it, especially on acoustic instruments. I could see that,
Yeah, for sure. Just something to keep in mind. Okay, So that's the first thing. So let's talk about the second thing where tone comes from. And this is a really huge deal for me personally as a player because, so talking about a little bit my tone journey, I started out as a drummer first, and then I picked up bass because I thought it would make my drumming better by learning a second instrument. But by going in that order, I definitely still feel like I play bass like a drummer would play bass. And so from the very beginning when I was learning, part of my learning process was either being influenced by or just trying to figure out intervals. So bass lines as far as intervals from the root notes, like what could I play that would sound good as a riff, I guess, in the context of if there's a repeating chord progression, what intervals can I play around and sound cool? But not only just the intervals, but also the rhythms were a big deal to me as well. And I feel like that plays a big deal into this idea of tone too. Like, it's not just the sound of the instrument, but there's a lot of bass players out there that I could instantly tell you who the bass player is, even if they were on a completely foreign rig or like a toy guitar, just based on the riffs that they're playing.
Okay.
And I have a few examples of these that I wanted to bring up to give you guys examples. So there's people like Flea. I think his bass lines are so recognizable, and that's why, and he's the bass player from the Red Hot Chili Peppers, if you haven't heard of Flea before, which I would be amazed, but I guess they're all getting older, so maybe the younger generation hasn't yet. But I think the reason why he keeps showing up on the list of best bass players, I don't think it's because he's actually the best, but I think that he plays very unique intervals and rhythms. So that's one. Next one is Les Claypool. He's just kind of his own animal. He just does.
Oh my God, yeah.
There's nobody that sounds like Les, and yeah, go check out Primus. Interesting stuff. Not the weird music, but interesting stuff.
Mm-hmm.
People like Geddy Lee, very unique bass player. Jaco Pastorius is probably, arguably, the best bass player ever. Victor Wooten, who can pretty much play whatever he wants, anything. And maybe a little known one, James Jamerson, but he played on all the Motown records. So anything from that era is basically his bass lines. And I just think it's interesting how even seeing the tablature and playing, like, you just kind of know just from seeing what they're doing that it's these certain players just based on what they're doing rhythmically and intervally. Okay, so the next thing that we're going on to comes down to the bass construction itself of your instrument. So different types of woods and materials change the tone drastically. Now, I'm not a wood buff whenever it comes to knowing what all basses are made out of, but I know that the denser the wood, the more sustained and the darker the tone that you typically get. Also, maple tends to be a lot brighter than rosewood when you're talking about. That's even on the necks of guitars and basses. I've noticed that I like to play maple necks a lot more than I like rosewood, even though I think rosewood looks prettier. What else? An interesting thing too is you can decide if you want a bolt-on neck or a neck-through design. So a bolt-on is your neck is a separate piece from the body, whereas a neck-through design is the neck goes the whole length of the body. And there are some trade-offs whenever it comes to having a neck-through design. They're not as punchy as a bolt-on. So I prefer having a bolt-on design, but if you want something that has more sustain, you definitely want a neck-through type of bass. There's even basses out there that have some exotic materials, like Modulus was really popular for a while because they were making their necks out of carbon fiber. And it had the wildest sound. I played one before, and they're just super aggressive and bright, just because the neck was made out of carbon fiber.
Interesting. And so is that, in that case, is it bolt-on, obviously, I guess? Or is it glued?
It's bolt-on, and it doesn't come with truss rods because the neck never moves.
Oh my God, because it's so stiff already?
Yeah, it never changes with the weather.
That's amazing.
It's crazy.
That's really interesting, yeah. I know, and that's very similar to what you described to guitars. On guitars, you have basically three types of necks. There's a bolt-on, There's something called a set neck, which is like what Gibsons have, and is basically a glued joint. And then there's neck through. But neck through, I used to think neck through meant that the whole guitar was made out of a single piece of wood, but that would be crazy expensive. What it actually means is that, like you said, the neck goes all the way through kind of the body of the guitar, but then there's two like wings that are glued on to the side of that the main body to make the rest of the body. So I assume it's the same for basses.
Yeah, and you're exactly right, because think about that. If it was the whole body, you would have to have a tree that was that thick, so more expensive.
Exactly, yeah.
So moving on, this is partially under the construction of the bass, but I separated it out because they're a whole animal in and of itself. And forgive me, I don't know too much about this, but pickups can have a huge effect on your sound, whether they're single coil or humbucker, active or passive. And there's a whole bunch of different styles of pickups too. Some that come with their own preamps that do interesting things, or even add a distortion circuit or a gain circuit to your tone. But there's so many different kinds of ones, and like I said, forgive me, I don't have a lot of.
Well, maybe just talk about in your playing, in your experience, because actually your bass has two pickups, doesn't it? Or no, does it only have one?
It only has one. I prefer. Well, it's a single humbucker is the way that they work.
That's right. Okay, that's right.
And actually,
it's kind of like located. It's kind of like, where's the location between the neck joint and the bridge? Is it like roughly halfway, or?
It's about 1/3 of the way towards the neck away from the bridge. So it's closer to the bridge than the neck. And
closer to the bridge, okay.
Yeah, and that's one of the reasons why me personally, I gravitated towards playing the Ernie Ball style basses, is because I think their pickup is in the most ideal position for playing. And I like to rest my thumb on the pickup whenever I'm playing fingerstyle. And that's like the most ideal place to play. It drives me crazy whenever I play other basses where I think that they purposely split the difference with the pickups, just on either side of that. And I almost need like to glue another piece of wood like in between the pickups, which they do make that kind of a thing to have like a resting position for your finger.
Joe Golden's ears are burning right now. You talk about gluing pieces of wood onto your...
Oh yeah, but it's a pet peeve of mine to not have that pickup in like the ideal location. And I mean, it's even interesting too that like I couldn't even tell you why, but I just prefer the sound of a single humbucker versus a double humbucker setup. And I know that they're like really popular out there, but I just like the way that they look and sound a lot better, like a single humbucker versus that dual setup or even single pickups. That's pretty much all I had to say on pickups. I don't know if you wanted to add anything. I feel like guitarists always are thinking about like hot rodding their instruments way more than bass players are.
I'm thinking about it right now. I think about it all day, every day. Yeah, no, it's probably good for a different episode. We'll keep going here with the bass stuff.
That's so funny to me because like I feel like anytime I'm around guitar players, like all they want to talk about is just like what pickups they swapped out into their.
Yeah, I don't know.
It's just a thing.
I've never done it, but I've been really curious lately, and I'll tell you what. I'm not going to name the manufacturer, but probably once a week I'll go on their website and like customize my pickups that I want and add them to my shopping cart. And I haven't pressed the purchase button yet, but I'm getting close.
It's just something to note out there if you like the way that your bass feels and plays, but maybe you're not completely happy with the way it sounds. Maybe try changing the pickups in it. It's a good idea, at least. All right, so we talked a little bit about this already, but I don't know about guitar so much, but I know for bass in particular, like when I think of a manufacturer, I think of distinctly different tones. If I were to say Fender jazz bass, like I can think of specific albums and tones that or artists that bass goes with.
Can you give me one? Like, give me one that's like a classic Fender jazz bass sound.
So two that come to mind are Timmy C. I forget what his last name is, but the bass player from Rage Against the Machine. He plays a jazz bass.
Yeah. Comerford. Yeah, Tim Comerford.
Yeah. Flea earlier in their career played a jazz bass on some Red Hot Chili Pepper albums. Also, probably the most recognizable, Geddy Lee from Rush.
Okay.
Yeah. So there's that. Also another Fender. So we have a Fender P bass. I just think of all the pop punk records I've ever heard. It's pretty much P bass straight across the board. But going on from there, we've got Ernie Ball Stingray, like what I play. I would say that tone is pretty much like full spectrum, maybe a little bit brighter on top, like maybe a little bit scooped. So nice low end and nice high end with a little bit of scooped mid range. Warwick basses are really interesting to me because they have just a very distinctive woody, like subby deep tone to them. So you've got Peanut from 311. He plays a Warwick. The early Incubus albums, their original bass player, he had a Warwick. The bass player from POD, he plays a Warwick, and they all sound the same. They have that tone to them. It's just like, it sounds like he's beating on like a big log. That's the only way I can describe it. It just has that tone to it. And then maybe for more modern day guys, Dingwall basses, I see them all over the place now, but those are like the new hot rod bass guitars made popular by probably Nolly and Periphery.
I've heard Nolly describe that as like the bass that was made for like a modern metal sound. It's kind of, I guess that was his feeling on it anyway. And I think, yeah, that's the bass he chose to use for all the Periphery stuff.
Yeah. So, I mean, I see them out there. I haven't played one, but I mean, just from hearing records and stuff, they sound awesome. So, but it's just interesting how I'm going to
look up a picture right now. I want to see what they look like.
Oh, they look amazing. They look like all of these old basses. So that's one interesting thing. Like the bass guitar, like all these designs are back from like the 60s and 70s, or maybe even earlier. But like bands are playing them back then. And I feel like all of them kind of look like classic cars or muscle cars. And then the Dingwall just looks like...
Oh my God. They look awesome.
The sexiest... They look like the sexiest, like, new age, slick Tesla sports car. You know what I mean?
Yeah. They look awesome.
Yeah, so moving on from there, strings obviously play a big role in the tone of your instrument as well. And you can get traditional nickel plated or maybe more fancier ones like steel or a higher percentage of chrome in your steel, which is what I prefer. They're also the most expensive, but they sound the best and the brightest. I think a pack of 5-string Ernie Ball Slinky Cobalts are like $50. They're very expensive, but they sound amazing. So if you think about it, though, if you're recording an EP or a record, because that's forever, I totally would spend $50 to get a nice pair of strings to record with.
Sure.
I wouldn't play shows with them, but I would, record with them.
Yeah.
And string gauge plays a big role in your tone as well. I prefer the lightest gauges possible, but still with enough tension that they don't feel like rubber bands. You get more mid-range and high-end tone out of thinner strings. I think that's kind of what I'm going for because I don't want just subby round bottom end. Because I don't feel like it's hard to get low end from a bass. It's harder to get the articulation in your bass tone. So that's kind of why I prefer the thinner gauges. But definitely another thing to keep in mind with that too is whatever gauge you decide to go with is going to be related to how heavy that you play. Now I'm really heavy-handed whenever I play. Like I'm hitting the strings so hard, probably harder than I should. But if you have a really light touch, you can get away with thinner gauges than if you're really heavy-handed. Okay, moving on. So the next phase in our chain of bass tone is pedals. Yes, I guess we'll go with pedals here. So there's a lot of different options. Maybe I should have put pedals later in the chain. Even though they're next in the chain, they're probably not as important as the amp, but we'll just talk about pedals for now, and then we'll finish up with amps and stuff like that. So I would say if you've never tried using a compression pedal before, on bass, I would recommend going out there and trying it. Because I think that compression on guitars is like optional and maybe something cool you could play around with, but I would argue that with bass, it's almost a necessity. And the reason is that because a lot of times bass has way less, if no distortion on it, the dynamic range of the instrument is very large. It's very huge. So playing into a compressor is just going to help to smooth out your tone a lot more before it hits the rest of the pedals in your chain or it goes to your amp. I think it just helps things in general.
And that compressor, it's not like there's no tone splitting going on there. The whole signal is going through that compressor, right?
Yep, that's exactly right.
Okay. So is that the first pedal in your chain typically?
Yep, first pedal in my chain is the compressor, and it just kind of evens everything else out. Because if you think about it, if I play a really heavy note or I get excited and I want to play a note really loud, on bass, that's going to have a huge volume difference. And if I'm going into, even to my amp, but into any kind of overdrive or distortion circuit, I'm going to be pumping, I'm going to be like boosting my volume going into that. So instead of that note maybe being louder, it's just going to have more distortion on it. So having a compressor just kind of helps to level things out a little bit better. It also helps with just kind of the smoothing out the low end. And I kind of had my own issues with this as like kind of a bass player playing in live bands, because I wanted to be like Flea. So I wanted to play a lot of notes and be really fancy and whatever. And I noticed part of the problem was if I wasn't playing in the lower register, or maybe I wasn't playing held out or a consistent bass line, I was moving around a lot or playing a lot of staccato notes, that the low end would kind of just fluctuate around a lot, fall out and just not be there. But if you have a compressor on and set that, if it has a release toggle on it and you set it to, maybe not slow, but somewhere between medium and fast, it just kind of helps to hold on to the notes a little bit more, and then you get a more smooth low end to kind of sit under the rest of like the instruments in the band. I think it helps a lot.
Yeah, I think that's huge. I know bass players I talk to always talk about that. They always talk about how crucial that compression is to their tone, and I believe them, but I never fully understood that, because it's not quite like that for guitar, especially for distorted guitar, because you already have that amp distortion is already the most extreme compressor in the history of compression, so you don't really need to think about it as much. You don't want to reduce dynamics any more than that.
Yeah, it is true. And that's why for the longest time, I never even knew about it or played through a compressor, but once I discovered it, I couldn't go back.
And talk about your settings again one more time. In terms of like attack and release, what are you going for there?
So attack, I want to be the attack as slow as possible, which means I want more of the initial signal to get through without the compressor turning on. And the reason I want that is because if I'm playing hard or I'm picking hard, I want that punchiness to get through. I don't want the compressor so I want the attack to be slow and the release to be set somewhere between medium fast to medium.
Okay.
So it's kind of, and it depends on the tempo or the style of music that you're playing. But you want it to kind of grab and hold on to those notes so that when you stop playing, it's still kind of holding on to a little bit of that note that you stopped with. Now, we could get into a lot on overdrive and distortion and all that kind of stuff. So I guess I'll just touch on it briefly. And this goes into my tone journey a little bit too. So the first time I ever messed around with overdrive or distortion was I saw an ad in a bass player magazine, and Fieldy from Korn was repping his Fat Head Ibanez distortion pedal, and fat was spelled P-H-A-T, Fat.
Of course it was.
Yes, way back in the day. And I was like, oh, that's the coolest thing ever. So I bought it, and of course in my cover band, I was playing it on every song. It didn't matter if it was Brown Eyed Girl or a Weezer song. That overdrive distortion pedal was coming on in the choruses. And obviously I barely use it anymore. The only time I use it, it's still in my pedal chain, but the only time I use it is if I'm Like if I just want some nasty guitar like effect.
It's pretty gritty.
It's very gritty and noisy and
Okay.
terrible sounding. And
Okay.
it's not very useful, but it did get me to start messing around with distortion on bass a little bit and seeing like what that could do with my tone or do for my tone. And one thing I'll say is like, I guess I'll kind of divide distortion on bass up into 3 different categories. And we'll get into this a lot more in the second episode because it comes into play a lot more with recording than I think with just having a standard bass tone. But I will mention it here real quick. So the 3 different categories I would divide them into is like kind of natural distortion, which is like amp breakup with your gain. Some amps have that built into them and other amps don't. So I will make that disclaimer. So don't just turn up your amp trying to distort or you might blow a speaker. But some amps are kind of like my Mesa is kind of designed. The more you turn up the gain, the more kind of harmonic-y distortion you get with it. So it's just kind of cool to turn the gain up that way. The other type, and that's the least noticeable type of distortion. That's more like extra harmonics and thickness, I would call that, more so than actual audible fuzz, which leads into the second type of distortion, which I would call like fuzz distortion or big muff distortion, which is like, just think of early Muse records. Their bass player uses a lot of fuzz type of things, especially Hysteria, like that. I would probably call that like a big muff type of fuzz type of distortion. And then the last one is more guitar, high, bitey, overdriven type of distortion, which is kind of what I prefer. But you do have to be careful with it because you can really sap the low end of your tone on bass with that. So normally when you're talking that type of distortion, you want to blend that in with either a DI signal or if you have a pedal like I have on my Darkglass B7K, it has a blend knob on it. So I'm normally going somewhere between 40 to 60% blending in the clean tone with the distortion.
Right. So what we're talking about there, in case you're not familiar with that, like a wet, dry knob is basically you're feeding some signal into this pedal. The pedal is doing something to it. And then this wet, dry knob lets you, or the mix knob or the blend knob, whatever you want to call it, lets you control how much of the unprocessed signal is getting through the pedal versus how much of the processed signal is getting to the output. And you can have that anywhere from, I guess, 0%, which would be the pedal's not doing anything, the signal's coming in and just coming out unchanged, to 100% when like all of the signal is being completely changed by the pedal, to a blend. And you're saying you're going somewhere between like 40 to 60%, right?
Yeah.
So you're still getting that. And I guess you're saying that the dry signal, the unprocessed signal, is where the low end is coming from, and then you get the distortion, bitey stuff from the pedal, which is very cool. Yeah, that's a nice feature on a bass distortion pedal for sure.
Yeah, I feel like they need to have it. I mean, the other option is not the cheap option, but I know that Muse, from seeing their rig rundowns, he literally had like 2 bass rigs going at the same time, and one of them was just a clean bass rig, and the other had all of his distortions on it. And the reason for doing that is that on bass in particular, distortion just doesn't sound good on the low frequencies, and I don't know the exact reason for it, but I would imagine it has to do with the fact that you're getting different notes without changing the frequency number that much. And so when you're adding those higher order harmonics, you're kind of overlapping with other notes in the scale, and it just starts to sound muddy instead of nice.
Interesting. That's a really interesting way of putting it. I never thought about it that way, but it totally makes sense. And yeah, distortion on those, really not just bass, but anytime you have a bass element, even if it's like a synth, low frequencies are not going to sound great distorted. Things are going to get muddy and flubby and a mess.
Yeah, so that's something to be aware of. And it actually took me a long time to find a pedal that did bass distortion really well. Like, once I found that B7K, I was willing to give them however much money they asked me to to own the pedal. But I've tried so many different kinds of distortion. I think I tried 10 different pedals, and I just wasn't happy with any of them. And I think it really came down to that issue, was that the distortion sounded good, but the low end just sounded like it wasn't there. Like it wasn't there at all. So that's something definitely to keep in mind if you're looking into that. Now, the other type of effects we could maybe talk about too a little bit. I don't really play with these anymore, but they were fun to learn with wah and auto wah, just because it's fun to play funky stuff sometimes. And
dude, I'm about to sell my Crybaby. It's been sitting for 15 years. I don't think I've played it once. I'm gonna finally decided to sell it.
Yeah, I mean, I don't really do too much with that style anymore, but it can just be really fun on bass to have like a wah effect type of thing going on. So
yeah, it is fun.
And the nice thing about auto wah is that you can kind of set it like with attack and release times like you would a compressor, and it will just do all the work for you without having to bend your foot.
Right.
There's also synth effects that you can add. Bass synth is pretty cool. Like you can get some 80 sounding stuff. And of course, like I would be remiss if we didn't talk about some of our favorite like emulations. I know like Neural DSP makes a couple plugins that just sound killer on bass. But Native Instruments has a few, and there's a couple others out there too that like just sound really good on bass. And lastly, I guess we'll talk about amps here too. Like they're probably more important than the pedals that you're using, but we're just going down in order of the chain here. So the main two categories, I guess we have solid state and tube amps. And you talked about that a lot more back in episode 13, as far as the even order harmonics and the odd order harmonics go. Like I didn't even know that was a thing, or that make up the difference between solid state.
Did I?
Yeah.
I don't know. You're telling me that, and I'm not sure. I don't remember saying it's possible. Anyway,
yeah, you
go on.
You definitely did. I mean, that was more just kind of the technical of like what it is that they're doing. I don't understand what that means. I just know that I prefer the sound of tube amps because they just have this warmth to them. They sound awesome. But I will say that solid state's getting very good to emulating what a tube amp can do. Like I have my M9 carbine that I have is a 900 watt tubed bass amp head that cost me, it was like $2,500, pretty expensive. And I also have a solid state Mesa Boogie Subway 800 Plus is the model. It's an 800 watt solid state amp head that only weighs 5 pounds. It's super easy to lug around. I think only cost me like $800, and it sounds like 95% as good.
Really?
It's really, really close. So
wow. I know for guitar amps, solid state amps sound great clean. Usually you can get really good clean tones out of them. The beef people have with them is like the distortion tends to be a little kind of brittle and harsh. It's kind of like the same beef people have with amp modeling, right? Like especially before amp modeling got as good as it is today. But yeah, tube amps give you a couple of nice characteristics. One is like, it's kind of like the digital versus analog discussion where like with a tube amp, you can feed, the hotter the signal you're feeding into the amp, the more it starts to break up, and it's kind of a gradual breakup. So you can get like you were talking about, a little bit of breakup and a little bit of warmth, everything to like gnarly gritty breakup that sounds kind of really warm and organic. Whereas with solid state amps, typically it's like on or off, like you're either clean or you're distorted, and the distortion can be a little harsh or brittle sometimes. So that's the beef people have with them. But like you said, I mean, first of all, they're way lighter.
yeah,
Second
way
of all,
later.
they're more affordable. And also less maintenance. Like tubes
maintenance.
go bad, they blow out, you got to replace them. Yeah. So there's compelling reasons for both. And I didn't realize that. So is that solid state Mesa Boogie you have? Is that like intended to? That's the intention of the design, is to get close to like a tube sound, then be more affordable?
I don't think so. I think it's just to be affordable. But the nice thing with bass is that I'm really not looking for like a broken up bass tone coming from my amp. Like the way I'd normally dial in my tubed amp is
you're going into a clean amp anyway, and you're getting a distortion from the dark glass. Yeah,
exactly. So I guess you could get away with solid state amps a lot more on bass.
That makes sense. And we talked about that on the gain staging episode, where like if you do want distortion, it's good to pick maybe one or maybe maximum two stages to get that distortion from. And so like on my guitar rig, which I did this on, episode 32, when you were on vacation, enjoying the great outdoors, I found with that setup that I wanted all of my distortion to come, or I would say I used two stages. I wanted most of my distortion to come from the power amp of the tube amp and a little bit from the preamp. And my signal going into the amp was completely clean and unboosted. And that's just a decision I made based on how that amp sounded with my guitar. And you're saying you're kind of doing the opposite, where you're preferring to get your distortion from the pedal gain stage and then go into a clean amp, which is another way of doing it.
Yeah, and I'm thinking out loud a little bit here too, but I think the reason it works like that better on bass is that bass distortion is kind of like stealing a note from the guitar player's like handbook. Like whoever made that dark glass pedal was innovative and brilliant. They were like, okay, so all of these albums, we get this gritty bass tone by reamping, and we'll talk about this in the next episode, but we get this gritty bass overdrive from reamping our bass DI through a guitar amp and miking that up. But what if we could capture that in a pedal and emulate that?
And that's a great point, because that's what you don't get with your amp. Like if you get distortion from your amp in your setup, you have no choice. There's no blend knob. You have no choice but to distort the whole bass frequency spectrum, frequency spectrum. Whereas with the dark glass, you get that option of still blending in the clean lows. And so that makes sense why you're doing it that way. Yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah.
Cool. That's awesome. I never thought about it that way, but that makes a ton of sense to me. I was always wondering how, because I know from a mixing standpoint, from mixing a lot of heavy bass, exactly like you said, there's like that reamp component to it. And I was always wondering how people did that in live setup. So good. I learned a lot.
Awesome. So I only have a couple more notes here.
Cool.
And so you might be asking yourself, okay, I'm looking for an amp. What do I buy? I recommend going to a guitar shop and take either your bass with you or the same model of bass and just plug into some different amps and just see what they sound like. Because for me, the choice to go with Mesa had to do with Ernie Ball Stingrays that I play. They tend to sound pretty bright. And what I like about Mesa is it kind of helps to tame and control that high end without it sounding too harsh or bright, which is kind of my problem with going through an Ampeg rig. Like, nothing wrong with Ampegs, but I think Ampegs tend to be bright anyways. And so adding that brightness, and there's a lot of bass players that do the whole Stingray through an Ampeg, and that's fine if they like that, but I just don't like the highs to be that punchy. And so for me, it was just kind of a perfect marriage of the two. And I think if you're playing a different kind of bass, you might not like the Mesa for different reasons.
Like, I always get a kick out of reading forums when people are like,
my gosh,
use these amp settings, 6, 8, 7. I'm like, what are you talking about? There's no context for it.
It doesn't mean anything. So that's so funny.
Trying it out is a nice, especially if you're thinking about making a bigger investment. Most places will let you, bring your instrument and actually plug in and try it, and I think that's huge.
Yeah, another thing too, like, you really don't need to go overboard with the wattage. Like, the wattage is your power. It's how much output your amp head can do. And so I have two heads. One is 900 watts and the other is 800 watts. And it is beyond way too much power.
That's a lot of power, yeah.
It's so much power. Like, I played one gig at PPG Paints Arena. I couldn't remember the name because they changed the name so many times, but it's the arena where the Penguins hockey team plays.
Oh, nice.
And so, like, huge arena gig, front house is way out of there. And I'm like, oh, now I could finally crank up my amp and see what this baby can do. And I didn't even get to halfway. And the front of house guys are like, turn the bass down. It's too loud.
That's awesome.
And I was like, I'm not even at halfway. So I don't know what venue that bass was made for, but
that's insane. Wait, they didn't have your rig mic'd up at all?
No, they had it mic'd up, but they were just saying my stage volume was overpowering the mains.
Oh my God. That's awesome.
I mean, even 500 watts might be too much, but like that's the most you would ever need from a bass.
Well, I've been saying for, I said it last episode too, I'm a big fan of these mini heads now for guitars because you can get really good, they're small tube amps, you can get really good sound, like, you can get, some of them have a power switch that you can get like, what is it, 1 watt or 5 watts or 15 watts or whatever. You can have these different switchable options. Honestly, they're still plenty freaking loud for small venues.
Oh, yeah.
And if you get into anything bigger venues will typically mic up your amp anyway. So they're really affordable. They're small amps. So you can give yourself, a couple different options instead of investing in like one giant Marshall head. So I'm a big fan of that.
All right. So last thing, I'm going to drop some big revelatory news that I found out by going through some tone stuff this past weekend. And this will lead into next week's follow-up or whenever we do the part 2 of this episode. So
should I drum roll? What's this big announcement?
Oh, just wait for it. So
okay.
I recorded my bass for a song that one of the artists that I've worked with over the past couple of years, she's getting ready to release a new single, and she asked if I would play bass on it. And I said, yeah, sure, I'll do it. So I took this opportunity to mic up my bass in like every possible which way. So I took a DI, I took a direct out of my amp head and reamped that through a plug-in cab emulation, which was really cool. I mic'd up my cabinet to get a whole bunch of speaker positions and locations and combinations. And I gotta say, I really, when it comes down to it at the end of the day, I kind of preferred the DI tone going through the Neural DSP plugins as much as anything else.
What? Really?
So at least whenever, maybe we're not quite there on guitar yet, but I feel confident enough to say that we're to the point where you don't even need to bring your amp to the recording studio anymore. We got plugins that are good enough that sound probably as good or better than your rig.
Oh my God. Can't wait. I can't wait to hear these tones because that's huge. I mean, that's a huge claim.
It's equally awesome and so disappointing. It's just disappointing that I've spent so much money on my bass rig and now we have like plugins that cost maybe a little bit over $100 that can replicate something just as good. So you'll have to tune in next time to the DIY Recording Guys to hear some of those examples and hear us talk more about. So we talked about dialing in a bass tone today, but next time we're going to talk about capturing that dialed in tone. Until then, check yourselves
before you wreck yourself.
Have a good one.
If you're enjoying the podcast, take a minute to leave a rating wherever you like to listen to it, or share it with your friends on social media. Also, Benjamin and I are working engineers, and we love helping people turn ideas into finished productions. So if you're interested in working with one of us, or just want to discuss a project you're working on, reach out. You can find my work at calmfrogrecording.com, get me on Instagram at calmfrogrecording, or shoot me an email, vk@calmfrogrecording.com. And you can check Benjamin's work out at dreamloudstudio.com. Hit him up on Instagram at dreamloudstudio or by email, ben@dreamloudstudio.com. And finally, join our Facebook group to engage with a whole group of friendly, like-minded people who are interested in DIY recording. Just search for DIY Recording Guys on Facebook. Thank you so much.